and welcome to the GVSU Art Gallery. I'm Amanda Rainey, the User Experience and Learning Manager here. This is our third Live from the Gallery session. If you want to watch or re-watch any of the previous sessions, you can find them on our IGTV channel. And we'll also post this one on YouTube tomorrow, along with a bunch of additional links and info about the posters and artists and topics that I'll talk about here today. I also want to quickly plug some of the other exhibitions and programs that we have going on at the Art Gallery. Art Gallery at GVSU actually means everywhere, all over campus. We have galleries on walls in buildings like the Haas Center, where on view now is an exhibition titled Artifacts of Identity, Tintypes of the Modern Persona, original tintype photographs by Grand Rapids artist Bud Kibbe, alongside tintypes from the late 1800s and early 1900s. You can also find this exhibition online at gvsu.edu/artgallery/artifacts. It's a mouthful. We're also hosting a month-long virtual poster making workshop where you can make your own poster inspired by this exhibition. Celebrate people's history. Visit the link in our bio to download the template and follow the step-by-step guide. That's going on until October 6th. So let's jump into the Celebrate People's History exhibition. I suspect that you're here with us because you either haven't seen the exhibition yet or because you're interested in learning more about some of the posters. So feel free to drop questions into the comment section and we'll try and get those answered. Today I'm going to talk about the idea of intersectionality and introduce you to two individuals whose lives and work exist at the intersection of multiple identity categories and genres, both of whom are celebrated on posters here in the gallery. Audre Lorde and Octavia Butler. Follow me along this way. So first, what is intersectionality? If you're not familiar with this term, watch Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk on the subject. Kimberly Crenshaw is a leading thinker and scholar in the field of critical race theory and a professor at both UCLA and Columbia Law School, where she directs the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies and is a co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. She first coined the term intersectionality in a scholarly paper in 1989 as a way to help explain the oppression of African American women. It was intended as a legal term, but has since made its way into mainstream vocabularies and has really been co-opted by political discourse. We could spend another hour talking about the impact of this term, intersectionality, on contemporary identity politics, but today I'll simply define its original meaning in order to frame our look at the lives of these two women. So, Kimberly Crenshaw defines intersectionality as a lens or a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. She goes on to say, follow me this way, that we tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just a sum. For example, it's a known fact that women make less money over the course of their lifetime than men, but you may hear less about how other differences in the experiences of women impact their quality of life, like experiences related to child rearing, divorce, or caring for older family members. And then when a woman is also Black, Latina, or Latinx, or an immigrant, the impact is compounded. Crenshaw cites an income statistic to illustrate this point that I think is super powerful. She says, data show that white women's annual income is somewhere in the $40,000 range, while Black women's is $100. $100. So all of this is to say that the experiences of women differ greatly depending on race, sexual orientation, economic status, ability or disability, and other identity factors. And these factors impact how they are discriminated against, but also how they express themselves and what they choose to fight for. And so I think it's important to absorb the cultural contributions of women who are also Black, women who are also gay, women who are also disabled or overlooked or disenfranchised economically. And there are many posters in this exhibition that honor women or groups like this, but today I'm just going to focus on two, and we're going to start with Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde proudly describes herself as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior poet. Lorde is an American poet, writer, feminist, librarian, and civil rights activist who was born in New York City in 1934. She dedicated her life to fighting for the injustices of racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, and homophobia. And she passed away in 1992 after a battle with cancer. This poster celebrating her life was done by American artist Arthur Katrina, and this poster includes a few lines of Audre Lorde's poem, A Litany for Survival, a poem that describes the fear that comes with living an intersectional life and urges those who do to fight back. The poster gives us just the last few lines of this poem, but I think that the whole poem really packs a punch, so I want to take a minute and share it with you. Here we go. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. And when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Whew, I love that one. This poem is really just as relevant now as it was when it was published in 1978, if not more so, in the midst of ongoing nationwide protests against systemic racism and a pandemic that's killing more people of color than white people. During her lifetime, Audre Lorde became known for technical mastery and emotional expression in her writing. She didn't just identify with one category, but really wanted to celebrate all parts of herself equally. In her 1982 novel, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, she focuses on how her many different identities shape her life and experiences. In The Cancer Journals, her 1980 book of nonfiction, where she addresses her struggle with breast cancer, she writes, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." She's also the subject of a documentary called A Litany for Survival, the life and work of Audre Lorde, which shows her as an author, poet, human rights activist, feminist, lesbian, teacher, survivor, a crusader against bigotry. In this documentary, she's quoted as saying, "What I leave behind has a life of its own. I've said this about poetry, I've said it about children. Well, in a sense, I'm saying it about the very artifact of who I have been." Now, I could spend, again, quite a long time talking about Audre Lorde's accomplishments and discussing the impact of her life and her career on contemporary culture. So I hope that this brief introduction moves you to dig deeper into her work and into her life. I'll include links to her poems and that documentary in our Insta stories later today. The other poster that I want to highlight today celebrates Octavia Butler. We gotta walk a little bit across the gallery to see it. Personally, I think that's the beauty of this exhibition, is that there's so much to see. You can really come back over and over again. Octavia Butler was a science fiction writer born and raised in Pasadena, California in 1947, the community of Pasadena. where she experienced cultural and ethnic diversity in the midst of racial segregation. And this was the 1950s. And this poster was designed by artist Susie Wilson, and it also features a quote by the writer: "There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And to really grasp the meaning of those words, I think that it's important to understand their origin and a little bit about the evolution of Butler's work. So bear with me here, we're going to do a little bit of a rundown on her CV. Octavia Butler began publishing science fiction novels in the 1970s with a book called Pattern Master. If you're a fan of science fiction, you may be familiar with this series. The series has become known as the Patternist series. It's 5 books in total that depict the transformation of humanity into 3 genetic groups. One group of humans who have been bred with heightened telepathic powers, another that are disease-mutated animal-like superhumans, and a third group of ordinary humans. This inventive sci-fi narrative hints at themes of race and class and gender, and it's really characteristic of many of her novels. Her best-selling work, Kindred, uses the device of time travel to explore issues related to race and the impact of slavery across generations. Butler's also been associated with the genre of afro-futurism. The most popular example of this genre, of course, is the movie Black Panther. But some critics have actually noted that while Butler's protagonists are of African descent, the communities that they create are multi-ethnic and sometimes even multi-species. For example, in the 1980s, Butler published a series called the Xenogenesis Trilogy that examines the theme of alienation by creating situations in which humans are forced to coexist with other species to survive. But what I want to spend the most time talking about in terms of Octavia's publishing career is her last series, called the Parable series. Sadly, she was only able to publish 2 of the planned 6 books in this series, which depict the struggle of a fictional religious community called Earthseed to survive the socioeconomic and political collapse of the 21st century in America due to the, quote, coinciding climatic, economic, and sociologic crisis. So this series of books is actually based in 2020s and beyond, and they depict themes that are eerily familiar today. In the last book that she published before her death, which is called Parable of the Talents, her narrator starts off the book by stating, "I have read that the period of upheaval that journalists have begun to refer to as the apocalypse, or more commonly, more bitterly, the pox, lasted from 2015 through 2030, a decade and a half of chaos. This is untrue. The pox has been a much longer torment. It began well before 2015, perhaps even before the turn of the millennium. It has not ended." The narrator goes on to say, "It would be more honest to say that the pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with obvious problems in those areas, meaning the climate, the economy, and social justice. We caused the problems, then we sat and watched as they grew into crises." Gives me chills. If this sounds a little too real, a little too familiar to be science fiction, it's meant to be. The Parable series is actually more closely aligned with a genre called mundane science fiction, or stories that really adhere to the laws of physics as we know them, but are still ultimately fantasy. So today, Butler's Parable series really feels more like prophecy than fantasy. Even though she passed away before finishing the 3rd Parable book, which was to be titled Parable of the Trickster, we actually have access to some of the texts. She bequeathed a big chunk of her estate to the Huntington Library, including unfinished drafts and false starts of Trickster, alongside notes and deleted scenes from the previous 2 books. And those papers are discussed at length in this really great article in the Los Angeles Review of Books by a professor of literature at Marquette University named Jerry Canavan. So Canavan explains in this article, "What the all-important dream of the Parable series offers us is a chance not to abolish human nature, but to perhaps temporarily suspend it." Her cynicism led Butler to think humans as a species wouldn't behave more decently toward each other and towards our environment unless and until we have literally no other choice, and maybe not even then. But her optimism led her to believe that when push finally comes to shove, we are actually capable of it, and might actually do it. So the epigram she chose for trickster, even though it was never published, captures this tension between optimism and pessimism, and the possibility of actually breaking through this psychic impasse into something new quite wonderfully. And that's where we get this quote: "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." Poof. Coincidentally, Octavia Butler and Audre Lorde both passed away at the age of 58, far too early. So I hope that these insights have helped you to see how the impact of these two individuals persists in our contemporary culture today, and I also hope that you'll check out more about their life and their work and about this exhibition. Look for those links I mentioned in our Insta stories, and we'll see you next week when we hear from Art Gallery Director Nathan Kemmler. Thanks.